Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in her family. Growing up in a small Texas town where Friday night football games drew bigger crowds than church services, she spent most of her childhood reading books while her three brothers played sports in the backyard. Her father, a retired Marine, had tried countless times to get her interested in outdoor activities, but Sarah preferred the company of fictional characters to the rough and tumble world her siblings inhabited. At 18, Sarah was a slight girl with thick-rimmed glasses and calloused fingers from years of playing violin. She stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed less than most high school freshmen. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she had a habit of chewing her bottom lip when she was nervous, which was often. The idea of joining the military had never crossed her mind until the day she received her college rejection letters. The stack of thin envelopes arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her mother hovering nearby with a coffee mug, watching as her daughter opened each letter with trembling hands. Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Princeton, one by one, the rejections piled up. Her dreams of becoming a biomedical engineer seemed to crumble with each polite but firm "we regret to inform you" paragraph. Her father found her crying in the garage later that afternoon. He didn't say much, just handed her a tissue and sat beside her on an overturned paint bucket. After a long silence, he cleared his throat and spoke quietly about options she hadn't considered. The military, he explained, offered educational benefits that could make college possible down the road. More importantly, it offered something Sarah had never had: the chance to prove herself in a world where determination mattered more than where you came from. The idea seemed ridiculous at first. Sarah had never fired a gun, never hiked more than a few miles, and had certainly never imagined herself in combat boots. But as the weeks passed and her college fund dwindled, the military began to look less like a last resort and more like an opportunity. Her father shared stories from his own service, carefully avoiding the darker aspects while highlighting the friendships, the sense of purpose, and the confidence that came from overcoming challenges she never thought possible. By summer, Sarah had made her decision. She would enlist in the Army as soon as she graduated high school. The decision shocked everyone who knew her. Her violin teacher pleaded with her to reconsider, offering to help her apply to music schools. Her best friend Emma called her crazy, insisting that someone like Sarah had no business in the military. Even her mother, who had been supportive throughout the college application disaster, worried that her sensitive daughter wouldn't survive the harsh realities of military life. The most vocal opposition came from her brothers. Mike, the oldest at 22, had played college football before an injury ended his career. He worked construction now and possessed the kind of natural athleticism that made physical challenges look effortless. When Sarah announced her plans over dinner, he actually laughed out loud. "Sarah, you can't even open a pickle jar without help," he said, gesturing with his fork. "What makes you think you can handle basic training?" His younger brothers, twins named Jake and Danny, nodded in agreement. They had inherited their father's broad shoulders and their mother's competitive streak, excelling at every sport they tried. The idea of their bookish sister in military fatigues struck them as genuinely absurd. "No offense, sis, but you're just not built for that kind of thing," Jake added. "Maybe you should look into community college instead. There's no shame in starting smaller." Their father intervened before the conversation could become more hurtful, but the damage was done. Sarah went to bed that night more determined than ever to prove them wrong, even though she had no idea how she would manage it. The next morning, she started running. It was painful and awkward at first. She could barely make it to the end of their street without stopping to catch her breath. But she persisted, adding a little more distance each day, ignoring the stares of neighbors who weren't used to seeing the Martinez girl in running shoes. Summer passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah read every military manual she could find, studied fitness routines online, and pushed her body harder than she ever had before. She learned to do push-ups, even though she could only manage 3 in a row at first. She practiced making her bed with military precision, timing herself until she could complete the task in under 2 minutes. Most importantly, She worked on her mindset, trying to develop the mental toughness she knew she would need. Her family's skepticism remained constant throughout her preparation. They weren't cruel about it, but their doubt was obvious in every conversation. When she mentioned her daily runs, someone would always ask if she was sure she was ready for real military training. When she practiced military terminology, her brothers would exchange glances that suggested they were humoring a child playing dress-up. The worst moment came 3 weeks before her departure. Sarah had been practicing with a workout routine she'd found online, trying to improve her push-up count in the backyard. Her brothers were throwing a football nearby, and she could hear them discussing her upcoming enlistment in voices they thought were too low for her to overhear. "She's going to wash out in the first week," Mike said, catching a pass from Jake. "I give her 3 days," Danny replied. "Remember when she cried because she got a B+ on that chemistry test? She's not cut out for people yelling at her. Dad should have talked her out of this," Jake added. "She's going to embarrass herself, and it's going to break her heart." Sarah stopped her push-ups and sat back on her heels, feeling the familiar sting of tears. They weren't being malicious, she knew that. In their minds, they were being realistic about their sister's limitations. But hearing their certainty that she would fail hurt more than any physical training ever could. That night, she called her father aside and asked him directly whether he thought she was making a mistake. He looked at her for a long moment before answering, his weathered face serious in the dim light of the living room. "Sarah, I've seen a lot of different people succeed in the military," he said finally. "Some of them are natural athletes, some were brilliant strategists, and some were just too stubborn to quit. But you know what they all had in common? They refused to let other people define their limits." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Your brothers love you, but they've never seen you push to your real limits because you've never had to find them. The military will show you what you're truly capable of, but only if you're willing to discover it." The conversation gave Sarah the resolve she needed to push through her final weeks of preparation. She stopped listening to the well-meaning but discouraging comments from family and friends, focusing instead on her own goals. She researched the basic training facility where she would be stationed, learned about the different military occupational specialties available to her, and mentally prepared herself for the biggest challenge of her life. Her departure date arrived on a crisp September morning. The entire family gathered at the bus station to see her off, and despite their reservations, everyone was trying to be supportive. Her mother packed enough snacks for a week-long journey, even though the bus ride would only take 6 hours. Her father gave her a small notebook with his contact information and advice written in his careful handwriting. Her brothers were awkward, but genuine in their goodbyes. Mike hugged her tightly and whispered that he hoped he was wrong about her chances. Jake and Danny gave her a lucky charm they bought at the local sporting goods store, a small compass with an engraved message about finding her way home. As the bus pulled away from the station, Sarah pressed her face to the window and watched her family grow smaller in the distance. For the first time since making her decision, she allowed herself to wonder if they were right. Maybe she was too small, too sensitive, too different from the typical military recruit. Maybe she would wash out in the first week and return home humiliated. But as the familiar landscapes of her hometown disappeared behind her, Sarah felt something else growing inside her, a quiet determination that surprised her with its intensity. She had spent 18 years being underestimated, 18 years being told what she couldn't do. Now, she had the chance to find out what she actually could accomplish when no one else's expectations were holding her back. The bus carried her through changing scenery as the day wore on. Small towns gave way to larger cities, which eventually gave way to the flat, unforgiving landscape surrounding Fort Benning, Georgia. Other recruits had boarded at various stops along the way, and Sarah found herself studying them discreetly. Most were young men who looked like they'd stepped out of military recruiting posters, tall, broad-shouldered, confident in a way that Sarah envied. There were a few other women scattered throughout the bus, but even they seemed more prepared for what lay ahead. Sarah overheard conversations about high school athletics, previous military family members, and childhood dreams of military service. She felt increasingly out of place as the miles passed, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. As the sun began to set, the bus finally approached the gates of Fort Benning. Sarah could see the imposing entrance in the distance, complete with uniformed guards and official military vehicles. Her stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and terror as she realized there was no turning back now. In a few hours, she would be just another recruit in a system designed to break down individual identity and build something stronger in its place. The bus came to a stop with a hiss of air brakes, and immediately the atmosphere changed. Drill sergeants boarded the vehicle, their voices cutting through the nervous chatter of the recruits like knives through paper. Sarah grabbed her single duffel bag and followed the crowd off the bus, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork, medical checks, and constant movement from one station to another. Sarah was assigned to Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion, along with 60 other recruits who would become her training family for the next 10 weeks. As they were herded into their barracks for the first time, Sarah caught glimpses of her fellow soldiers-to-be and realized she was definitely the smallest person in the group. Her bunk assignment put her next to a girl named Jessica from Ohio who had played college basketball before enlisting. Jessica was nearly 6 feet tall, with the kind of natural athleticism that Sarah had always envied in her brothers. On her other side was Maria from California, whose father and grandfather had both served in the Marines. Even among the female recruits, Sarah felt like she didn't belong. That first night, as she lay on her narrow bunk listening to the unfamiliar sounds of 60 people trying to sleep in one large room, Sarah thought about her family back home. She imagined her brothers placing bets on how long she would last, her mother worrying about her baby girl in this harsh new environment. Part of her wanted to prove them wrong so badly it physically hurt. Another part of her wondered if they might be right after all. The wake-up call came at 4:30 in the morning, announced by the ear-splitting sound of trash and lids being banged together by drill sergeants who seemed to have been born without the ability to speak below a shout. Sarah jolted awake, disoriented and terrified as chaos erupted around her. Recruits stumbled out of their bunks, trying to dress and make their beds simultaneously while drill sergeants circled like predators, noting every mistake and hesitation. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to remember the bed-making technique she had practiced all summer. The fitted sheet kept coming loose, and her blanket refused to achieve the tight, wrinkle-free appearance the drill sergeants demanded. She could feel eyes on her as she struggled, aware that she was taking longer than everyone else and drawing unwanted attention. "Martinez!" a voice boomed behind her. Sarah turned to face Drill Sergeant Williams, an intimidating woman whose presence seemed to fill the entire barracks. "What exactly are you doing over there, recruit?" "Making my bunk, Drill Sergeant," Sarah responded, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "That's not a bunk, Martinez. That's a disaster. Do it again, and this time pretend like you've seen a bed before in your life." Sarah tore apart her bedding and started over while her bunkmates finished their tasks and moved on to other responsibilities. By the time she finally achieved something resembling military standards, she was already behind schedule for the morning routine. She grabbed her toiletries and raced to the bathroom, where she discovered that privacy was a luxury that no longer existed in her life. The physical training that followed breakfast was a rude awakening to just how unprepared Sarah really was. Despite her summer preparation, she found herself struggling to keep up with even the basic exercises. The push-ups she had worked so hard to master at home felt impossible when performed in front of drill sergeants who seemed to take personal offense at any sign of weakness. During the morning run, Sarah found herself falling behind despite her best efforts. The pace that felt comfortable for most of her fellow recruits left her gasping for breath and fighting to maintain her stride. Other soldiers passed her one by one until she was running with a small group of stragglers at the back of the formation, their labored breathing and obvious struggle marking them as the weakest links in the company. Drill Sergeant Thompson, a wiry man whose voice carried across the entire training field, had apparently decided to make Sarah his personal project. He ran alongside her, offering commentary that was equal parts motivation and humiliation. "Come on, Martinez. My grandmother moves faster than this, and she's been dead for 10 years. What's your excuse?" Sarah wanted to respond that she was doing her best, that she had never run this far or this fast in her life, that her lungs felt like they were on fire and her legs were turning to rubber. Instead, she saved her breath for the monumental task of putting one foot in front of the other, determined not to be the recruit who collapsed on her first day. The run finally ended after what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. Sarah bent over with her hands on her knees, trying not to vomit while her heart hammered against her ribs. Around her, other recruits were catching their breath and talking in low voices, but none of them looked as completely destroyed as Sarah felt. Jessica, her bunkmate, jogged over with a concerned expression. "You okay? You look like you're about to pass out." Sarah straightened up carefully, aware that several drill sergeants were watching her with expressions that suggested they were already writing her off as a potential failure. "I'm fine," she managed to say, though her voice came out as more of a croak. "It gets easier," Jessica offered, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced this was true for everyone. The rest of the day continued in the same vein. During combat training, Sarah struggled to master the basic movements that came naturally to recruits with athletic backgrounds. Her punches lacked power, her defensive stances were awkward, and her attempts at grappling techniques often ended with her on the ground while her training partner looked apologetic. Weapons training was scheduled for later in the week, but Sarah had already heard enough conversations to know that marksmanship would be another area where she would likely struggle. Several of her fellow recruits had grown up hunting with their fathers or had participated in shooting sports in high school. Sarah had never held a real gun in her life, and the prospect filled her with both excitement and dread. That evening, as the company settled into their second night at Fort Benning, Sarah overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Two recruits from her squad were talking in low voices near the bathroom, apparently unaware that she could hear them from her bunk. "I don't think Martinez is going to make it," one of them said. "Did you see her during PT today? She could barely keep up with the warm-up." "Yeah, and tomorrow we start getting into the real stuff," the other replied. "Combat training, weapons handling, tactical exercises. If she can't handle a morning jog, how's she going to manage when things get serious?" I heard Williams talking Thompson about her. They're already discussing whether she should be recycled to a later class or just sent home entirely. Sarah pulled her blanket over her head and tried to block out the conversation, but the damage was done. She had been at Fort Benning for exactly 36 hours, and already her drill sergeants were considering her a lost cause. The thought of returning home as a failure, of facing her brother's knowing looks and her family's gentle disappointment, made her stomach churn worse than any physical exercise could. But as she lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of 60 exhausted recruits finally settling into sleep, Sarah felt something hardening inside her chest. It was the same feeling she had experienced when her brothers laughed at her decision to enlist, the same determination that had carried her through months of preparation despite everyone's skepticism. She might be the smallest, weakest, least prepared recruit in Alpha Company. She might embarrass herself daily and struggle with every task the drill sergeants threw at her. But she was not going home as a quitter. Whatever it took, however much it hurt, however many times she had to get back up after being knocked down, Sarah Martinez was going to make it through basic training. The next morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities to fail, and new chances to prove that sometimes the most unlikely candidates possessed the most unbreakable spirits. Sarah closed her eyes and began to plan how she would approach tomorrow's training, unaware that her real test was still weeks away, waiting for her on a rifle range where everything she thought she knew about herself would be turned upside down. The third week of basic training arrived with the promise of weapons instruction, and Sarah had mixed feelings about finally getting her hands on a real rifle. Every night, she had watched other recruits clean imaginary weapons with practiced movements, their hands moving with the confidence of people who had been around firearms their entire lives. Meanwhile, Sarah could barely remember which end was which from the instructional videos they had been forced to watch. Weapons training began in a sterile classroom where Master Sergeant Rodriguez introduced Alpha Company to the M4 carbine that would become their constant companion for the remainder of their military service. The rifle looked massive in Sarah's small hands as she tried to follow along with the disassembly demonstration, her fingers fumbling with components that everyone else seemed to handle with natural ease. "The M4 is not your friend," Rodriguez explained to the room full of attentive recruits. "It is a tool, and like any tool, it is only as effective as the person using it. Respect it, maintain it, and it will serve you well. Neglect it, and it might be the last mistake you ever make." Sarah scribbled notes furiously, trying to capture every detail of the weapons safety brief, the proper cleaning procedures, and the countless regulations governing the handling of military firearms. Around her, other recruits nodded along with the confidence of people who had heard similar speeches from hunting fathers and shooting instructors. Sarah felt like she was trying to learn a foreign language while everyone else was already fluent. The practical portion of weapons training began the following morning on a range behind the main training area. Sarah's squad was assigned to Lane 7, where they would spend the next several hours learning the fundamentals of marksmanship under the watchful eye of Staff Sergeant Collins, a soft-spoken man whose calm demeanor was a welcome change from the constant intensity of the drill sergeants. Collins gathered the 10 recruits assigned to his lane in a semicircle and began explaining the basic principles of accurate shooting: sight alignment, breathing control, trigger squeeze, and follow-through, concepts that sounded simple in theory but proved challenging in practice when Sarah finally got her hands on a loaded rifle. The first shots were fired from a supported prone position at targets only 25 meters away. Sarah carefully aligned her sights the way Collins had demonstrated, took a deep breath, held it halfway out, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder with surprising force, and she completely missed the large paper target. "Don't worry about it," Collins said, kneeling beside her. "First shot is always the hardest. Let's talk about your grip and see if we can get you more comfortable." For the next hour, Collins worked with Sarah individually while the other recruits took turns shooting and scoring hits with varying degrees of success. He adjusted her shooting position, corrected her grip, and patiently explained the sight picture over and over until Sarah finally managed to hit the paper target, though nowhere near the center rings that would indicate real accuracy. By the end of the first day of range training, Sarah's shoulder ached from the recoil, her ears rang despite the hearing protection, and her confidence had taken another serious blow. While other recruits compared their target scores and discussed shooting techniques with obvious knowledge and enthusiasm, Sarah quietly packed up her equipment and tried to ignore the concerned looks from her instructors. That evening, Jessica found Sarah sitting alone outside the barracks, staring at her hands in the dim light from the building's security lamps. Her bunkmate had performed well on the range, scoring in the upper ranges on her very first attempt and earning praise from Collins for her natural shooting ability. "Rough day?" Jessica asked, settling down on the concrete steps beside Sarah. "I couldn't hit anything," Sarah admitted. I could barely even hit the target, let alone get anywhere near the bullseye." Collins was trying to be nice about it, but I could tell he's worried. Jessica was quiet for a moment before responding. My dad taught me to shoot when I was 12, and I've been hunting with him every fall since then. I probably fired thousands of rounds before today. You've been doing this for what, 8 hours? "It doesn't matter," Sarah replied. "Everyone expects me to fail at everything, and so far I haven't disappointed them. I can't run as fast as everyone else, I can't do as many push-ups, and now I can't shoot straight either. Maybe they're right. Maybe I just don't belong here." "That's bullshit," Jessica said firmly. "You've gotten better at everything since we started. Remember your first PT test? You could barely do 10 push-ups, and yesterday you knocked out 25. Your run times are dropping every week. You're improving faster than anyone else in the company because you're working harder than everyone else." Sarah wanted to believe her bunkmate, but the evidence seemed to suggest otherwise. During the second day of range training, her performance showed only marginal improvement. She managed to hit the target more consistently, but Her shots were scattered across the paper with no real pattern or grouping. Collins continued to work with her patiently, but Sarah could see the frustration building behind his calm exterior. The other recruits in her lane had begun to notice Sarah's struggles as well. During breaks between firing exercises, she overheard conversations that made it clear her poor performance was becoming a topic of general discussion. Some recruits expressed sympathy. Others made jokes they thought she couldn't hear, but everyone seemed to agree that Sarah Martinez was not cut out for military service. The worst moment came during the third day of range training when Drill Sergeant Williams appeared at Lane 7 to observe the morning's shooting exercise. Williams had a reputation for showing up whenever a recruit was struggling with a particular skill, and her presence usually meant that someone's military career was about to take a dramatic turn for the worse. Sarah tried to ignore the drill sergeant's presence as she took her position on the firing line, but knowing that Williams was watching every move made her hands shake even more than usual. She lined up her sights, controlled her breathing, and squeezed the trigger with what she hoped was perfect technique. The shot went wide, missing not just the bullseye, but the entire target. "Martinez!" Williams barked from behind the firing line. "What the hell was that supposed to be?" "A miss, Drill Sergeant," Sarah replied, keeping her eyes on the target downrange. "No kidding, it was a miss. That wasn't even close to a miss. That was a complete failure to engage the target. Are you planning to miss the enemy that badly when you're deployed?" Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment as the other recruits on the firing line tried to pretend they weren't listening. "No, Drill Sergeant. I'll do better." "You'll do better?" "Martinez, you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn if you were standing inside it. How exactly do you plan to do better?" Sarah didn't have a good answer to that question. She had been trying her absolute best for 3 days straight, working with Collins during every break, practicing her shooting stance in the barracks, and studying marksmanship manuals late into the night. Despite all her efforts, she seemed to be getting worse instead of better. Williams continued her critique for several more minutes, using Sarah's poor shooting as an example of what happened when recruits weren't properly motivated to excel. The entire exercise became a public humiliation that left Sarah fighting back tears as she tried to focus on the target in front of her. After Williams finally moved on to terrorize recruits on other parts of the range, Collins approached Sarah with a concerned expression. He knelt beside her firing position and spoke in a voice that was intended to be encouraging but came across as somewhat desperate. "Sarah, I know you're trying hard out here, but we need to see some significant improvement before the qualification shoot next week. Right now, you're not even close to the minimum standards, and if you can't qualify with your weapon, you can't graduate from basic training." The qualification shoot. Sarah had been dreading this event since the first day of weapons training. Every recruit had to demonstrate basic proficiency with their rifle by scoring a minimum number of hits on targets at various distances. Failure to qualify meant recycling to another training company to repeat weeks of training, or in some cases, being discharged from the military entirely. "What can I do differently?" Sarah asked, genuinely desperate for any advice that might help her improve. Collins looked thoughtful for a moment before responding. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Your fundamentals are actually pretty good now. Your shooting position is solid, your breathing is controlled, and you're squeezing the trigger smoothly. But something isn't clicking for you, and I can't figure out what it is." That night, Sarah called her father from the pay phone outside the barracks. She had been avoiding contact with her family for weeks, too embarrassed about her struggles to want to report on her progress. But now, facing the very real possibility of failure, she needed to hear a friendly voice. "Dad, I don't think I'm going to make it," she said without preamble when he answered the phone. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Sarah explained her struggles with marksmanship training, the upcoming qualification shoot, and the growing certainty among her instructors that she was not suited for military service. Her father listened without interruption, occasionally making sympathetic sounds, but mostly just letting her pour out her frustrations. When she finally finished her litany of failures, her father was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Sarah, do you remember when you first started playing violin? You were 8 years old, and you wanted to quit after the first week because the other kids in your class were already playing simple songs while you could barely hold the bow correctly. This is different, Dad. I'm not 8 years old anymore, and this isn't violin lessons. If I fail here, I don't get another chance. No, it's not different, he said firmly. You've always been someone who had to work harder than everyone else to achieve the same results. But you've also always been someone who refused to give up when things got difficult. That's what made you special as a violin player, and that's what's going to make you special as a soldier. Sarah wanted to argue with him, to explain that musical talent and military aptitude were completely different things, but something in his voice stopped her. He wasn't just offering empty encouragement. He genuinely believed that she could overcome this challenge, even when all the evidence suggested otherwise. What if I really can't do it? She asked quietly. Then you'll fail honestly, knowing that you gave everything you had. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think you're going to surprise everyone, including yourself. The conversation with her father helped Sarah's mood somewhat, but it didn't improve her shooting the next morning. If anything, she seemed to be regressing, missing targets that she had been hitting consistently the day before. Collins was running out of coaching techniques, and even his legendary patience was beginning to show cracks. During the afternoon shooting session, Sarah found herself paired with Marcus Johnson, a recruit from Alabama who had been shooting competitively since he was 10 years old. Marcus was one of the best shots in the entire company, consistently scoring in the expert range and making it look effortless. Under normal circumstances, being paired with such a skilled shooter would have been intimidating, but Sarah was beyond caring about embarrassment. Marcus watched Sarah shoot for a few minutes before offering some unsolicited advice. "You're overthinking it," he said during a break between firing exercises. "I can see you running through the whole checklist in your head before every shot. Sight alignment, breathing, trigger control, all that stuff is important, but you're turning it into this big, complicated process." "That's what Collins has been teaching me," Sarah replied defensively. "Collins is a good instructor, and his techniques work for most people. But maybe you need a different approach. Mind if I watch you shoot a few more rounds?" Sarah shrugged and took her position on the firing line. She went through her careful routine, methodically checking each element of her shooting technique before finally squeezing the trigger. The shot hit the edge of the target, better than many of her previous attempts, but still nowhere near the center rings. "Okay, I see the problem," Marcus said. "You're fighting the rifle instead of working with it. Here, try something different." For the next 30 minutes, Marcus worked with Sarah to completely change her approach to shooting. Instead of the deliberate, step-by-step process that Collins had taught her, Marcus showed her how to develop a more natural shooting rhythm. He emphasized speed over precision at first, encouraging Sarah to fire multiple shots quickly rather than agonizing over each individual round. "Don't think so much," he kept repeating. "Just point the rifle where you want the bullet to go and squeeze the trigger. Trust your instincts instead of trying to engineer every shot." The new approach felt wrong to Sarah at first. She had spent days learning the careful, methodical technique that Collins advocated, and abandoning the structure felt like giving up on everything she had worked to master. But as the afternoon progressed, something strange began to happen. Her shots, while still not accurate by military standards, started showing more consistency. Instead of scattered hits all over the target, her rounds began to group together in predictable patterns. Collins noticed the improvement immediately. "Whatever Johnson is teaching you, keep doing it," he said during the final shooting exercise of the day. "Your groups are tighter than I've seen them all week." That evening, Marcus found Sarah in the barracks and offered to continue their informal coaching sessions during any available free time. He explained that different shooters needed different approaches and that the standard military instruction didn't always work for everyone. "My little sister had the same problem you're having," he told her. "She could understand all the theory perfectly, but she was thinking too hard to shoot naturally. Once she learned to trust her instincts and stop second-guessing herself, she became a better shot than most of the boys in her class." Sarah agreed to continue working with Marcus, though she was careful not to appear ungrateful for Collins' instruction. The two approaches were completely different, but somehow Marcus's more intuitive method seemed to make sense for the way her mind worked. Over the next several days, her improvement was gradual but noticeable. More importantly, Sarah began to develop confidence with her rifle that translated into better performance in all areas of training. Her physical fitness scores continued to improve steadily, and she started speaking up more during classroom instruction. The constant fear of imminent failure that had dominated her first month of basic training began to recede as she proved to herself that she could master difficult skills with enough persistence. The night before the qualification shoot, Sarah lay in her bunk going through mental rehearsals of the next day's test. She would fire from 4 different positions at targets, ranging from 50 to 300 meters. The minimum passing score required hitting a specific percentage of targets, with bonus points awarded for shots that landed closer to the center rings. Sarah knew that she was still not the best shooter in her company or even in her squad. But for the first time since arriving at Fort Benning, she felt like she had a realistic chance of meeting the minimum standards. Marcus had spent the entire week working with her during every available moment, and Collins had expressed cautious optimism about her chances. Jessica, who had easily qualified during a practice session earlier in the week, offered words of encouragement as the lights went out in the barracks. "You're going to do fine tomorrow. I've watched you shooting this week, and you're hitting targets you couldn't even get close to a month ago." Sarah wanted to believe her bunkmate, but she had experienced too many disappointments during basic training to feel truly confident about anything. The qualification shoot would determine whether she could continue her military service or return home as a failure. Everything she had worked for since leaving Texas depended on her ability to hit targets with a rifle that had seemed like an impossible weapon just weeks earlier. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah tried to quiet her mind and trust in the training she had received. Tomorrow would bring either vindication for her decision to join the military or confirmation that her family had been right about her limitations. Either way, she would face the challenge with everything she had learned about persistence, adaptation, and the surprising strength that could be found in refusing to give up. The morning of the qualification shoot dawned gray and humid, with thick clouds hanging low over the Fort Benning ranges. Sarah woke before the official reveille call, her stomach churning with nervous energy that made breakfast impossible to consider. Around her, other recruits were going through their own pre-test rituals, some reviewing shooting fundamentals, while others tried to project confidence they might not actually feel. Alpha Company assembled at the rifle range before sunrise, their weapons cleaned and inspected to perfection. Drill Sergeant Williams addressed the formation with her typical intensity, reminding everyone that today's performance would determine who continued with the company and who might be spending additional weeks repeating basic training. "Some of you have been shooting since you could walk," Williams announced, her voice carrying across the humid morning air. "Others picked up a rifle for the first time 3 weeks ago. Today, none of that matters. What matters is whether you can meet the minimum standards required of every soldier in the United States Army." Sarah felt her hands trembling as she checked her rifle for the dozenth time, ensuring that every component was properly assembled and ready for the day's test. Around her, she could hear nervous conversations as recruits discussed strategy, shared last-minute tips, and tried to calm their own anxieties. Marcus appeared beside her as the company waited for range control to clear them for the day's activities. "Remember what we worked on yesterday," he said quietly. "Don't overthink it, trust your instincts, and follow through on every shot. You've got this." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed him. The past week of intensive coaching had definitely improved her shooting, but qualification day had a way of making even experienced shooters nervous. For someone like Sarah, who had been struggling since day one, the pressure felt almost overwhelming. Collins gathered Sarah's squad around lane 7 and reviewed the day's schedule one final time. They would shoot from 4 different positions at targets ranging from close range to the maximum distance of their rifle's effective range. Each position would test different skills, and recruits needed to score a minimum number of hits to pass the qualification. "Remember, this isn't about being the best shot in the company," Collins told them. "It's about meeting a standard that ensures you can effectively engage targets in combat. Focus on the fundamentals we've practiced, take your time with each shot, and don't let one bad round throw off your entire performance." The first firing position was prone supported, the same position where Sarah had fired her very first shots weeks earlier. Now, as she settled into the familiar stance, she tried to block out everything except the target in front of her and the rifle in her hands. The breathing techniques that had seemed so complicated initially now felt natural, and her grip on the weapon was confident rather than tentative. Sarah's first shot hit the target well within the scoring rings, a solid start that helped settle her nerves. The second shot grouped closely with the first, and by the time she had completed the prone supported portion of the test, she had achieved a score that would have seemed impossible during her first week of training. Collins appeared beside her as she prepared for the next firing position. "Nice shooting so far. Keep that same rhythm and mindset for the rest of the test." The prone, unsupported position proved more challenging, as Sarah had to maintain her shooting position without the artificial support that had made the first stage relatively easy. Her arms shook slightly from the effort of holding the rifle steady, but she managed to maintain the consistent technique that Marcus had helped her develop. Shot after shot found its mark, not always in the center rings, but consistently within the scoring zones that would count toward her qualification score. Sarah began to feel a growing sense of confidence as she realized that the improvement she had shown during practice sessions was translating to performance under pressure. The kneeling position brought new challenges as Sarah struggled to find a stable shooting platform while balancing speed and accuracy. Several of her shots landed closer to the edge of the scoring zones, but she continued to hit the target consistently. Around her, she could hear other recruits firing their own qualification courses, the steady rhythm of rifle fire punctuated by occasional commands from range safety officers. By the time Sarah reached the final firing position, standing unsupported at the maximum distance, she realized that she was actually on track to pass the qualification. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, as she knew that a few missed shots could still derail her entire basic training experience. The standing position had always been Sarah's weakest area during practice. Without any support for the rifle, every small tremor in her hands was magnified into significant movement at the target. She took extra time to steady herself before each shot, using the breathing techniques that Collins had drilled into her during their first week of training. Her first standing shot missed the scoring zone entirely, a heart-stopping reminder that nothing was guaranteed until the final round was fired. Sarah forced herself to reset completely, going through her entire shooting routine from the beginning rather than rushing to make up for the miss. The next shot hit solidly within the scoring rings. Then another. Sarah fell into the same natural rhythm that Marcus had helped her discover, trusting her instincts rather than overthinking every detail of her shooting technique. Shot after shot found the target, building the score she needed to pass the qualification. With only 2 rounds remaining, Sarah allowed herself to calculate her current score and realized that she needed both remaining shots to hit the target in order to meet the minimum standard. The pressure of that knowledge made her hands shake worse than they had all morning, and she had to pause to regain her composure before continuing. The penultimate shot felt perfect as she squeezed the trigger, but through her spotting scope she could see that it had hit just outside the scoring ring. One final shot to determine whether she would continue with Alpha Company or face the humiliation of failing basic training. Sarah took longer than usual to prepare for her final shot, aware that dozens of eyes were watching her as other recruits completed their own qualifications and gathered to observe the remaining shooters. She could see Collins standing behind the firing line with an expression of nervous concentration, and she knew that he was invested in her success almost as much as she was. The rifle settled naturally into her shoulder as Sarah aligned her sights on the distant target. Her breathing slowed and deepened as she found the natural respiratory pause that marked the optimal moment to fire. The trigger moved smoothly under her finger, and the rifle recoiled against her shoulder with the familiar kick that she had learned to manage over the past weeks. Through her spotting scope, Sarah could see that the final shot had hit near the center of the target, well within the scoring zone. She had done it. After weeks of struggle, embarrassment, and doubt, Sarah Martinez had qualified with her rifle and earned the right to continue her military training. Collins reached her position before she had even finished clearing her weapon. Outstanding shooting, Sarah. I'm proud of how hard you worked to get to this point. The relief was overwhelming. Sarah felt tears starting to form as the stress and pressure of the past weeks finally found release. She had proven to herself, to her instructors, and to her fellow recruits that persistence could overcome initial disadvantage. The girl who couldn't hit the broadside of a barn had just passed the same qualification standard required of every soldier in the Army. Marcus jogged over from his own firing lane, where he had undoubtedly posted an expert score without breaking a sweat. "Told you that you had it in you," he said with a grin. "You shot that last string like you've been doing it your whole life." Word of Sarah's successful qualification spread quickly through Alpha Company as recruits compared scores and celebrated their own achievements. For many of them, qualification had been a foregone conclusion based on their previous shooting experience. For Sarah, it represented something much more significant, proof that she belonged in the military despite all the early indicators to the contrary. The celebration was short-lived, however, as the drill sergeants quickly restored order and prepared the company for the next phase of their training. Basic training was far from over, and qualification day was just one milestone among many that separated the recruits from graduation. That evening, Sarah finally felt comfortable calling home to report her progress. Her father answered on the second ring, and she could hear the smile in his voice as she recounted the day's events. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Not because you passed the test, but because you didn't give up when things got difficult. That's the kind of strength that will serve you well throughout your military career." Her brothers were less eloquent in their congratulations, but Sarah could tell they were genuinely surprised and impressed by her achievement. Mike admitted that he had been wrong about her chances, and Jake and Danny promised to stop betting against her success. The weeks following qualification brought new challenges as Alpha Company moved into more advanced training topics. Combat tactics, field exercises, and leadership development all tested the recruits in different ways. But Sarah approached each new challenge with the confidence that came from knowing she could overcome initial failure through persistence and hard work. Her shooting skills continued to improve even after qualification, as Collins encouraged her to participate in additional marksmanship training during any available free time. What had started as a desperate attempt to meet minimum standards gradually became genuine competence with her rifle. 3 weeks after qualification, Alpha Company participated in a field training exercise that would test all the skills they had developed during basic training. The exercise included both individual and team challenges, with marksmanship playing a crucial role in several scenarios. Sarah's squad was tasked with establishing a defensive position that required accurate rifle fire to repel simulated enemy attacks. As they prepared for the exercise, Collins assigned Sarah to serve as one of the primary marksmen for her team, a responsibility that would have been unthinkable during her first weeks of training. The field exercise lasted 3 days and 2 nights, testing the recruit's ability to function effectively under stress and fatigue. Sarah found herself drawing on every skill she had developed since arriving at Fort Benning, from the physical endurance that had improved gradually over months of training to the shooting techniques that had transformed her from a liability into an asset. On the second day of the exercise, Sarah's squad encountered a scenario that required engaging multiple targets at varying distances under time pressure. The success of their mission depended on each squad member performing their assigned role effectively, with no room for the kind of mistakes that might have been acceptable during individual training. Sarah took her position behind cover and began engaging targets as they appeared on the range. The shooting felt natural now, as automatic as breathing after weeks of intensive practice. Her shots found their marks consistently, helping her squad achieve their objective within the allotted time frame. Collins, who was observing the exercise from a nearby position, made a note of Sarah's performance for inclusion in his final evaluation of her progress. Later, he would tell other instructors that Sarah Martinez represented everything that was right about the military training system: the ability to take someone with no apparent aptitude for a skill and develop them into a competent practitioner through proper instruction and personal determination. The field exercise concluded with Alpha Company gathering for an after-action review, where drill sergeants and instructors provided feedback on individual and unit performance. When Williams called Sarah forward to discuss her contributions to the exercise, there was no hint of the skepticism that had characterized their early interactions. Martinez showed significant improvement throughout this training cycle, Williams announced to the assembled company. Her performance during the field exercise demonstrated the kind of adaptability and determination that we expect from all soldiers. The praise felt surreal to Sarah, who remembered vividly the day when Williams had used her poor shooting as an example of inadequate motivation. Now, this same drill sergeant was holding her up as a model of what could be accomplished through hard work and proper training. As Alpha Company prepared for their final weeks of basic training, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since stepping off the bus at Fort Benning months earlier. The frightened girl who couldn't hit a target at 25 meters had been replaced by a confident soldier who could engage multiple targets effectively under combat conditions. More importantly, Sarah had learned something about herself that would serve her well throughout her military career and beyond. She had discovered that initial failure didn't determine final outcomes, that persistence could overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles, and that the opinions of others mattered less than her own willingness to keep trying. The rifle qualification that had once seemed like an impossible barrier had become the foundation for a completely different understanding of her own capabilities. Sarah Martinez had found her place in the military not despite her early struggles, but because of what those struggles had taught her about the power of refusing to give up.